The Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959, the island of Cuba, very close to the Florida mainland of the United States, became a communist state. For 2 years, Cuba and the United States had had a frosty relationship. Eventually, this relationship totally broke down with a breakdown in diplomatic and also economic relations. The relationship was absolutely destroyed when, in 1961, President Kennedy launched the Bay of Pigs invasions in an attempt to unseat the leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro. This landings gave Khrushchev the perfect excuse to send nuclear missiles and other military aid to Cuba. It was this that led to the 13-day Cuba Missile Crisis in the autumn of 1962. U-2 overflights uncovered Soviet missile bases in Cuba. These bases were able, as you can see from the map here, to hit most American mainland cities, causing a huge amount of fear inside the White House for President Kennedy and his advisors. President Kennedy, in response to the crisis, called a meeting of ex-com, which included his brother and Bobby, all the chief military advisors and diplomats that were responsible for maintaining American security. Kennedy was faced with several options. These options ranged from putting diplomatic pressure on the Soviet Union, a surgical air attack, a nuclear bombing raid, an invasion of Cuba, and a naval blockade of Cuba. On the 22nd of October, only 6 days after the discovery of missiles in Cuba, Kennedy announced live on television from the Oval Office in the White House that the American Navy was going to institute a 500-mile naval blockade around Cuba. At the same time, Nikita Khrushchev was determined to continue to maintain the upper hand in the crisis and was sending ships of his own carrying missiles en route to Cuba. The worst point in the crisis had now arisen. Khrushchev said that the Russian ships would not observe the blockade, would continue to sail on to Cuba. Kennedy had given the submarines and ships of the blockade the orders to sink the Russian ships if they did not observe the quarantine that the American Navy had placed around Cuba. It was at this point that the world held its breath, and the world was as close as it has ever been to an all-out nuclear war. Khrushchev knew, however, that his nuclear arsenal was far smaller than the Americans, and when his ships reached the edge of the blockade, it was Khrushchev who eventually blinked first, turning the ships around and returning them to the Soviet Union. In a sense, it looked like the blockade had worked. However, a problem remained. The missiles on Cuba were still there, and Kennedy needed to find a way to remove these. Kennedy and Khrushchev then devised a clever diplomatic solution. Khrushchev sent 2 letters to the United States. In his first letter of Friday the 26th of October, Khrushchev said that if assurances were given that the USA would not participate in an attack on Cuba and the blockade was lifted, then the question of the removal or the destruction of the missile sites would be resolved. This is the first time that Khrushchev admitted the presence of the missiles. This was obviously a very welcome message to Kennedy. Khrushchev then sent a second letter with a very different message, following an American U-2 also being shot down over Cuba. In this letter, he said that he would remove his missiles from Cuba if Kennedy, in turn, removed missiles from Turkey. Kennedy responded to the first letter, removing the missiles from Cuba in public. In private, however, Kennedy also had the missiles removed from Turkey in negotiations with his brother. The final outcomes of the crisis is that Khrushchev, in some senses, looked weak and undermined, although he had managed to maintain Cuba as a communist ally in America's backyard. Kennedy looked like a strong leader, able to stand up to the Russians and also avoid using nuclear force. The world realised the danger of nuclear war and the threat of MAD, and potentially this made the Cold War safer. Cuba remained communist and survived the crisis, and two things were set up. A hotline was set up between the White House and the Kremlin, so if a future crisis occurred, the leaders can talk to each other, and also negotiations were started on the Test Ban Treaty, which reduced to some extent the numbers of nuclear weapons that each side were able to develop. And there we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. See now if you can have a go at these simple questions.